And welcome to ETF Edge, your go-to place for everything exchange-traded funds. I'm your host, Bob Pisani. It's getting down to decision time on a Bitcoin ETF. Let's talk to a man who has an application in front of the SEC. Jan van Eck is the CEO of Van Eck. He's joined by Todd Rosenbluth, Director of ETF and Mutual Fund Research at CFRA. Jan, there's more than a dozen applicants for a Bitcoin ETF, but SEC Chair Gary Gensler has signaled his support for a Bitcoin futures ETF. He seems pretty cold to a pure Bitcoin ETF without clear regulatory control over entities like the Bitcoin exchanges. Can you handicap this at all for us? How is this going to play out?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a zero chance of a Bitcoin ETF approval. The deadline for our application, and these things can be extended, but this is an unextendable deadline by statute, is November 14th. So between now and November 14th or the Friday before, we'll know whether the SEC will approve physical Bitcoin ETFs or not. I would say that in the space, we launched the first pure play sort of cryptocurrency company ETF called DApp in April of this year. So I just wanted to make sure that people know that we do have a product in the market. But as far as regulatory approval, I do think as well, the SEC wants to have some visibility into the underlying Bitcoin markets. And I think they've got that a little bit when they asked Coinbase or told Coinbase not to list a product that gave interest on crypto holdings, and Coinbase backed off. So they clearly have some control over players in the underlying Bitcoin market. So maybe that increases the chances from zero, but I have no idea what they are.
Okay, so we now know November 14th is sort of the drop dead date for a Bitcoin ETF. Thumbs up or thumbs down. But what about Bitcoin futures? You've got an application for that as well. That's going to go live at the end of the month, I understand, unless there is objections and they kick the can down the road. What are the issues around a Bitcoin futures ETF? Can they kick the can down the road even on the Bitcoin futures at this point?
Yes. I mean, let me, at least from an investor perspective, and this is not regulatory, the issue with the futures ETF is the dynamics of the futures curve. And without getting complicated and talk about contango too much, in Bitcoin rallies, Bitcoin futures strategies can underperform by even up to 20% a year. So that's a pretty big number. The regulatory issues around it are, can U.S. ETFs invest in Canadian Bitcoin ETFs? That seems unlikely now. That's one issue. And the other is that there are limits on how much any fund or fund company can own in Bitcoin futures that's based on the futures contract. So what if the Bitcoin futures ETF gets too big? So there are still issues out there that might cause the SEC to delay approval.
Yeah, 20% underperformance is pretty significant. Todd, we don't have a Bitcoin ETF, but we're getting a raft of Bitcoin-related ETFs that are sort of buying companies around the crypto space. Last week, investors started trading 2 ETFs that can own crypto-related companies and even Bitcoin indirectly. Now, tell us about this new issues by Invesco, SATO, clever. They've attempted to partially fill the gap by launching the Invesco Alerian Galaxy Crypto Economy ETF and Sato as well. Tell us about that. What's in that?
Yeah, first of all, these are 2 of the longest names of ETFs that are around. But what they're owning are companies that are exposed to this overall trend of either crypto or crypto miners or other companies that are exposed to it. So Coinbase, for example, MicroStrategy being another one, Square, as well as you mentioned, they own a trust that owns exposure to exactly what we'd find of Bitcoin products listed on other exchanges in Canada and in other markets. But as you mentioned, there's a growing number of these products, and Jan touched on one of his, DApp, D-A-P-P. We've got BLOK, which is more blockchain related. We've got Bitwise with a product BITQ. We've got Global X with a blockchain related ETF. There's a lot of these products that are trying to fill the gap because we don't have a physical Bitcoin ETF. And it's possible, in fact, we think it's likely that we're going to see a delay of a Bitcoin futures ETF until 2022, until the regulatory environment is more clear and they line up all of these potential products to start at the same time instead of giving a mover advantage because they filed one day earlier.
Yeah, I want to know that SATO, the new Invesco ETF that started trading last week, is 15% invested in the PowerShares Cayman Fund, which is, I understand, a Bitcoin fund. So indirectly, these funds are getting exposure to Bitcoin one way or another. I find that very interesting. Going back to the regulatory environment, Jan, Bloomberg was reporting at the end of last week that the Biden administration was considering an executive order to coordinate regulation of cryptocurrencies and maybe even appointing a crypto czar. Is that where this is going? There's obvious, confusion here on jurisdictional issues.
Look, what's happening in the crypto space, the development of all the software solutions and applications is unbelievable. And it's a huge challenge for the regulators to keep up. I see blockchain competing against stock exchanges, against brokers, against payment systems. You now have Twitter accepting Bitcoin payments. So the level of innovation and the speed is unbelievable and very difficult for the regulators to keep up with. So I envy them, but some kind of high level like FSOC or czar, I think has a lot of trouble. I think the bread and butter is going to be the work with the agencies that are already staffed, like the CFTC and the SEC, and the banking regulators, of course.
Yeah, it just seems to me there are some very obvious jurisdictional issues. The SEC says a lot of tokens are investment contracts, and that falls under their purview, but that's not entirely clear. Gensler's also said he's reluctant to act on a Bitcoin ETF without regulatory control over the crypto exchanges. Who's going to give him that? So you seem to make the comment earlier about Coinbase and their a power grab is not the right way to describe it, but nobody gave them the jurisdiction. They basically went to Coinbase and said, no, you can't do this, and they backed off. So essentially they have de facto jurisdiction here without anybody clearly granting it to them. And that, you think, is what's going to happen, Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, boy, they would never want to think of it this way, but it's kind of a light touch regulatory approach. I mean, it's really, if you took the SEC at its word, it's very unlikely that all the cryptocurrencies listed on Coinbase and Gemini wouldn't be considered a security by their definition. So if they just require them to register as broker-dealers, that gets some jurisdiction. And look at Robinhood. I mean, Robinhood is a regulated broker-dealer, and they're listing and trading and offering all kinds of cryptocurrencies. So that gives them a direct nexus to those exchanges if they're looking for one.
So before I move on to, and I want to talk about ESG a little bit with both of you, November 14th, Jan, you mentioned the drop dead date for a thumbs up or thumbs down on a pure Bitcoin ETF. Is it really a thumbs up or thumbs down? If they say no, what happens after that?
Well, I mean, their prior concerns are that it's not a deep enough and it's a potentially manipulable underlying cash market. And if they take that stance again, then it's a deep freeze. If they give another excuse or reason to deny the application, I can't imagine what it would be, but that would be interesting, and everyone's attention would pivot to that. But again, my main point is the disruption investment in all this stuff is happening globally in a ton of different cryptocurrencies. Kind of Bitcoin is almost old school at this point.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think it's so important to clear up the regulatory and jurisdictional issues. If they tell them, okay, this is a security, these coins are securities, and the SEC will now have jurisdiction over this area, then they can make a clear ruling. I can't imagine him, given what he said, approving a pure Bitcoin ETF without the regulatory control he's seeking. That's why I think the chances are they're actually going to decline on November 14th. The futures are different. I think there's a very good chance they're going to approve that. It's just an unfortunate situation. Congress is bottled up dealing with the Biden agenda right now, and it's a lot for them to ask to, create a whole new regulatory regime and approve that. I just think it's going to be tough.